Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. On today's show, I speak with my colleague, Rebecca Keller-Friedman. Becca is a director at Adamantine, and she leads the research that we're doing for my upcoming book, The Moment. And that's in addition to her day-to-day responsibilities helping our clients navigate the intersections of climate, ESG, disruptive technology, geopolitical forces. Because we are at this pivotal time, the time I'm calling the moment, we can see that forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and easy energy transition. Now, in writing this book, I wanted to make sure that we had a good understanding of what's happening in the moment, of what's happening with the forces. So why are we conducting research on the moment? Number one, we want to understand the indicators that the moment is happening. We want to make sure that things that you kind of have this sense like, are things going a little haywire in California? Do Europeans actually want to import more natural gas? There's things that you think you know, but we wanted to make sure we know them. So we want to understand the indicators that tell us the moment is arriving, that these forces are actually happening. The second thing is all of us, oil and gas companies, those of us who represent the industry, we need a data-driven foundation that will inform how we speak to climate-centric stakeholders, particularly leaders in blue states or blue jurisdictions where there is a kind of energy transition narrative that says it is simple and it is easy. And so we need data that can inform a kind of conversation that could help make it clear that the moment requires different kinds of thinking. And then there's a third bonus reason we need research for the moment. And this is what's going to be really interesting. Really good leaders in the industry want to see what's coming around the bend. What's coming next? Well, they want to see past this particular political pendulum swing to what are the more enduring trends and what opportunities do they create for my business. So companies want to know what's happening. And so we want to do that research because that's how we advise our clients. But that's also how we will inform the positioning of the book. So that's three reasons that we need to do research at Adamantine and we need to have a solid understanding. Now, we did have some surprise findings and we've done some pretty big pivots on how we're thinking about forces in the moment. So listen on to find out. And then at the end, I'm going to provide some additional color commentary. I've been doing more work on our research even since we first recorded the podcast. And I think that we could make, as a society, more progress on reducing emissions, on climate action under President Trump. Why do I think that? Stay tuned. I think if you enjoy these kind of weird, quirky, wonky conversations, then please go to energythinks.com and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I want to thank you. I have a lot of overlap between the podcast audience and the reader audience. And you all have lost your minds in a good way for my recent pieces where woke went wrong and punch your friends. So thank you for all that engagement. Your ideas make my work stronger. Your pushback makes my work stronger. So keep it coming. You're going to want to know more about Becca. You can learn about that in our show notes. I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Rebecca Keller-Friedman. Rebecca Keller-Friedman, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, that's the last time I'll call you by all three of your names. In fact,
that sounds great.
We'll switch to Becca. So
perfect.
It's such a pleasure to get to introduce you to my audience. Because we are going to get to geek out today. So as I mentioned in the intro, Becca works for Adamantine. And as our audience knows, I like to work things out like verbally in public and sort things out. And so we're going to get to do that today. And I'm really excited. But so they know who they have the great pleasure of talking to. Can you tell our Energy Thinks listeners a little bit about yourself?
For sure. Again, my name is Rebecca Keller-Friedman, or more simply, Becca. I have about 15 years in the consulting industry by a way of a very weird thing called, I got my PhD in organic chemistry and then thought, I'm not going to use this. I'm going to go into consulting. But I look at the intersection of politics and emerging technologies and how those two things change each other and how they influence each other in the development and relationships. And that really dovetails into sustainability and the future of energy, because the future of energy is really reliant on technology development, but also on policy and regulation. So Adamantine was just a natural fit for the next stage in my career.
I love it. And I mean, a PhD in chemistry, to me, it tells me, one, you can do hard things, but also there's just sort of a magic of like, kind of like physics. Chemistry is the building blocks of everything. And so you have a way of approaching things that's completely different. For our audience, I'm a geologist, so it couldn't really be more different. And that's why I think we have such interesting discussions about the work we're doing. So to set up our conversations, I think our industry is coming upon a moment. And in this moment, civic and business leaders are going to have to think more pragmatically about the energy future. In short, the energy transition is harder than we thought, and addressing climate is complicated. And so we've been thinking about this in two broad buckets: forces and drivers. And you and I recently began exploring, like, how are we talking and thinking about forces and drivers? And we've updated our thinking. So you want to talk a little bit about where you started with forces and drivers, and how you suggest our audience think about forces and drivers. That's what we're going to spend our time on. What's pushing the energy transition toward decarbonization, and what's pushing against it? How do you think about those two things?
Right. And I think anything can be pushing against it or pushing for it at any given time. So what you do is you start with a neutral force. And what that is just the category of factor that is influencing the energy transition. That is the economics, the economy, or the demographics that are at play right now. It could be how reliable the grid is. It could be, our trade relationships with Europe. Any of those things are forces and neutral until you put them in the moment. And then you can see which direction they're going in. Is it a tailwind or is it a headwind towards decarbonization? And that's really how to think of it. And right now, and an easier way to think about it, or a more visual, I don't know, if you want to make the good and the bad, forces right now for us are negative. There's a headwind against decarbonization, and drivers are where the tailwind is. They're pushing towards decarbonization. But that being said, they could switch as the political winds switch, as people get older, and as just things change around us. And that's sort of the beauty of forces, that they're always constantly changing.
Let's think about headwinds. So there is a lot of people in the world that thinks an energy transition to lower carbon is inevitable. And there's a lot of civic and political leaders who talk about energy transition, net zero, as if it were easy or simple. And one of the things that inspired our thinking around the moment is that there's just a lot of evidence right now that the energy transition is hard and complex and expensive and maybe fraught in various ways. So can you talk about, and so we're going to talk about those as headwinds, the headwinds of the moment. Did you come up from our research with a top three, or do you want to summarize what you like when you, after looking at just, a dozen different potential factors, what do you think is most making the decarbonization energy transition the most difficult?
Yeah. So we started, when we think of neutral forces, we started looking at, I want to say 11 different categories. And of those 11, 6 we determined were on the side of, negative or headwind. And I wouldn't say I can rank them in like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but I can definitely say that some were stronger than others. And really looking at the headwinds to a low carbon future, you're looking at developed economies. Meeting the energy requirements of a growing middle class around the world is extremely hard to do without oil and gas, and even with low carbon oil and gas. The second is grid reliability. The way the United States grid is set up right now, the lack of modernization and the need to meet growing energy demand here, data centers is a linked force or a linked headwind as well. that needs low cost energy because electricity is price capped in a lot of areas. So utilities are sort of hand tied in what they can do. So you're choosing reliability of the grid over decarbonization of the grid. So those are the things that really stood out as the strongest group to me.
And those make sense. And I think are intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
When we started, we thought those two would be strong. Did anything surprise you? Either something we thought would be a headwind that turned out maybe not to be, or at least we don't have compelling data to support our ideas, or the opposite, like, whoa, that's going to be a big headwind, and it didn't occur to us early on. What surprised you?
Yeah, there were no true surprises with headwinds. We'll talk about the one surprise when we get to tailwinds, but I would say that data centers, that's all over the news right now, about that growing demand and needing to meet that growing demand. But because tech is leaning so hard on nuclear, and still trying to reach their low emissions goals or their net zero goals, that's not as big of a driver towards decarbonization, or against decarbonization as we thought it would be, especially because of that nuclear aspect. And then as far as California energy prices go, California is definitely a lessons learned on how not to do a clean energy transition and keep costs to the consumer low. But we also saw in some states really large fractions of renewables on the grid without those policy drivers towards it, and then costs not going up. So we still want to answer the question, is California doing something wrong, or is a policy driven transition towards net zero something that pushes against decarbonization because it can't be done cheaply?
Yeah, I concur that this idea of studying California to understand what one can do right, like what one can, California is neither a clear case for how to drive decarbonization through policy, but I thought it would be, but instead what we're finding is that it's not a clear case of what not to do either. And so it's just too big, too complicated. There's just so many factors around both power and fuel. So TBD, what we learned from California, we're still exploring that. Is there anything else that came out of the headwinds that you're excited for us to put more elbow grease into exploring, or is California really the one that we need to digest further?
I think California is definitely the most important, especially as we look towards, U.S. consumption going forward in the U.S. ecosystem. But supply chain risk is also a pretty interesting one going forward, because oil and gas is a more abundant resource than the dozens of minerals and metals that are needed for the electrified energy transition. But both are geopolitically influenced right now. That's honestly the reason why Greenland's being talked about in the news, if you get down to the nitty gritty of it. So really thinking about how that plays into the future, because it's sort of twofold. Oil and gas are more prevalent, so it's easier, it's more secure to have them in your supply chain versus renewables and battery power technologies. But in addition, it's the supply chain for associated or adjacent decarbonization technologies is even more vulnerable than renewables technologies in terms of access to the necessary raw materials. That's what we found in our research. So that's, speaking out loud right now, actually, I'm now going to put supply chain risk in the strongest category in terms of a headwind towards decarbonization.
Yeah, that our audience is getting a window into how we workshop these ideas. Like there's no, people will say, just, rely upon the facts. And it's like, that's not the analysis, the contemplation, the scenario planning. There is not one answer to these questions. And I commend you and the Adamantine team, because supply chain risk wasn't on my list of things I wanted researched. But intuitively, I think to our audience, it will make sense. If you think about just supply chain for oil and gas drilling, that is complicated. It is global. There are a myriad of factors. Now you want to do supply chain for CCS, geothermal, DAC, Well, these are all relatively nascent, and where they're supplied, how they're supplied, how our U.S. politics affect tariffs, rules, etc. Like all
Mm-hmm.
these things are TBD, and so and it speaks to when we get our act together around as a country, or prioritizing supply chain around certain things, like through the CHIPS Act.
Mm-hmm.
We can turn a headwind into a tailwind, but
Exactly.
that hasn't happened yet. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for raising that. Really,
Of
really
course.
interesting. So just to summarize for our listeners, when you think about the moment and you think about what is making energy transition more complicated than we thought, three headwinds that rose to the top are the reality of a growing middle class around the world and just what that means for coal consumption, oil and gas consumption, and ability to build other no and low carbon energy sources. The second is grid reliability. There's just so much about a growing need for electricity paired with what can provide that electricity that is going to make it more challenging to meet, for example, net zero targets. And then the third is this idea of supply chain for decarbonization, whatever that is. Could be oil and gas adjacent, it could be straight up renewables, it could be nuclear, right? Like because everything around the energy transition requires scale. Supply chain is going to matter, and once again, this is also invoking this idea of the 3 T's in time frame. Like you could solve for supply chain for a demo project. That's not solving for supply chain for 100 gigawatts of something.
Exactly. In 7 different locations. Exactly.
Right.
And the underlying commonality between all those drivers is still cost. Like that's still a big issue because that's sort of why we can't ensure grid reliability with decarbonization technologies right now.
Yeah, and cost. I think the myth that many of us participated in various ways that technology would like innovation would accelerate energy transition is not necessarily true when you think about scale.
Nope.
Cost and scale. So yeah, really good point. Okay, so let's pivot then and talk about our research around the tailwinds. Now, this is important, particularly to me at this juncture, because U.S. politics is going so dramatically in a like anti-woke, anti-climate direction that we want to cut through all that noise and say, over time, the energy system tends to decarbonize slowly and with cost in mind. But what are the factors that tell us that outside of politics, outside of federal level politics, decarbonization is likely to continue? Lower carbon intensity, interest in moving from higher carbon to lower carbon fuels and power. Like we want to understand, are there tailwinds that tell us that in 4 years there will still be a critical mass of interest in decarbonizing or not? So will you talk a little bit about what you found to be the strongest tailwinds?
For sure. So caveat, we began this research before the elections. So when we started this research, European demand was top of our list for drivers because US LNG producers were going to have to meet the emissions requirements of the new EU policy. And honestly, that still is a tailwind. It still remains a tailwind. It has been slightly weakened because you throw in the tariff aspect of negotiations. President Trump has used tariffs as a negotiation tactic with Europe before in terms of steel. So we could see that tailwind slow down or weaken, but it's still a tailwind. The other one is technological advancements. Yeah, we were just talking about how tech advancements don't necessarily mean a reduction in costs, but sometimes they do. Sometimes when you're making improvements just to your infrastructure in general through oil and gas, you are mitigating emissions naturally because the technology is better. You're wasting less product. It's less natural gas is getting leaked into the air. So because by becoming more efficient by technological improvements in that sense, that is a tailwind towards decarbonization in a natural way. Demographics. Now that's the surprise I was alluding to. It is a tailwind, but it isn't as strong as we suspected. We looked into, the drivers that millennials and Gen Z really do take environmental goals and targets into their consumption patterns. And that's true. But constraining their ability to influence the transition is the longer lifespan of the baby boomer generation and their consumption patterns. And then also what's going on around us right now. I'm a millennial myself, and right now climate for my generation isn't a high priority. I want to say that like Tufts did a poll where only 10% of respondents listed climate as a priority for them in this last election cycle. So the economy, reproductive rights, immigration, those are all taking precedent over climate in terms of voting patterns right now. So yeah, it's still a tailwind. People still make decisions based on influence on climate change, but it's not as strong as it once was.
A couple of things I want to reflect back to you and think aloud a little bit about. Mm-hmm. One thing that's really interesting about the top tailwinds is thinking about technological advancements that reduce cost, increase efficiency, et cetera. This implies, in some ways, a more nuanced consideration of what does energy transition mean. And I think for you and I and the team at Adamantine, energy transition means lowering carbon intensity. It doesn't mean getting off fossil fuels necessarily. Like that may be that may be a destination, but the where we have and will continue to see the greatest gains on a lower carbon energy system are still going to be transition from coal to gas. Mm-hmm. And from gas to lower carbon intensity gas. And that's like going to dominate the scale. And I hadn't been thinking in those terms, but that's going to be a really important piece for us to parse out. If you are a serious climate hawk kind of in the current orthodoxy, that's not a viable answer. Like that's not a viable tailwind, because you want your tailwinds to be towards zero carbon. So that's something I'm going to have to give a little thought to. I invite our audience to think about, like, how do we talk about this? How do we think about this? And it's also perhaps a gateway drug to a more nuanced conversation about energy transition and carbon intensity. So thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to reflect back to was, I too thought I've been saying, I don't know for how many years now, 6 or 7 years, that millennials are dominating the population until 2050. And critics of my work have said, yeah, but they're going to get more conservative because that's what generations do. And of course that is true. You as an example of many millennials are building their families. And so where does climate fall into your list of priorities when you got 2 kids to get to, hockey practice or whatnot? And so, but what's interesting, I think, in what we're seeing in the research, it's not that if you ask millennials, do you care about climate? Do you want climate action? They're still going to say yes, yeah. But will they list it in a priority? And then will they be willing to pay higher energy bills? That, again, it's like a nuance. It's a subtlety. And it's something important for us to understand, because our millennials may vote in certain ways or answer questions in certain ways that actually don't align with what they're willing to spend on. And so we're going to have to be quite discerning consumers of pulling information to understand what's a tailwind and what's a headwind here.
For sure.
Yeah. Interesting. So you talked about what surprised you. Is there anything you want us to spend more time on in our research, like that you don't think we really got to the bottom of?
I think that not necessarily spend more time on yet, but that we will have to spend more time on in the coming months as things evolve. is policy and regulation, because we have a hypothesis, our team has a hypothesis that policy and regulation is actually going to remain a tailwind, even in the Trump administration, because the foundation, and again, it comes down to money. It seems like everything is coming down to cost and money. But the foundation set in the IRA, in the Infrastructure Act, those all, that subsidy being supplied there is extremely strong, and the benefit is weighted towards red states and adjacent technologies in the oil and gas industry. So you'll have a set of trade organizations, of interests that typically would have gone against emission regulations, and they still will, but they are going to be pushing to keep certain subsidies that in effect will still be decarbonizing. It's just a different way of going about it. But it still remains to be seen exactly what the new administration will do with that foundation and how it will play out. So we know what people want. We know it will benefit certain states and certain industries, but it's a matter of what the executive office and the current Congress decide. So we're watching that, and we will probably research more in the future.
It's a really, really interesting point. And I have another hypothesis untethered from research that's just floating around in my head. But one of my hypotheses is that the US could make more progress on emissions reductions under a Trump administration and under, for example, DOE Secretary Wright and Governor Burgum being Secretary of Interior, because perhaps emissions reductions would be less politicized. And if just doing the thing that like is in the interest of the operators, the communities, if we start incentivizing actually carbon intensity reductions within fossil fuels rather than imagining that fossils are an all or nothing scenario, we could actually make a lot of progress under a Trump administration. So that could be really interesting. And if Canada has a federal conservative government, also very carbon intensive economy, the same thing could happen there, because you have all these actors in Canada, and we have a lot of listeners in Canada, so we love you. There's an industry like best in class carbon intensity reduction in Canada, and if you could actually have that become part of your plan as opposed to the sort of politicized all or nothing thing, we can make more progress. That could be really interesting as well. So that, I mean, of course, I'm always seeing the possibility for lower polarization. I have yet to be proven right, but that's something we could work on. Any other thoughts about that you want to say, Becca?
No, but I really like where you're going with that. So let's continue to explore.
Let's make it happen, right? And it only happens, like, we depoliticize when you, our listeners, depoliticize. So like, let's do it. Like, we do have the opportunity to contribute to a less polarized and lower emissions world. So let's do that.
Yeah. Call to action.
Right. Yes. So, so all of this work that you and the team have done around research came after I published a Both True, my weekly email. Is power demand a force or a directional driver? And of course, when we looked at, I thought it was going to be obvious. And then like everything, like it depends. It depends if something is a headwind or a tailwind. Like the millennial population could be a tailwind or a headwind, depending on what's happening in the economy, what's happening in the world. So one thing that could just be a real game changer, and I just don't know where it could land on this, is a price on carbon. Either because we're doing border adjustments. So what that is for our listeners is if the tariff environment essentially becomes around incentivizing US energy products because they are lower intensity, Canada would have the same advantage around the world. If there was a price on carbon around imports and exports, or there was just a price on carbon because it's a way to discern among fossils, right? Like and inputs to things. What's your latest thinking on price on carbon. I know people say it's dead, but I just can't believe that it is. I just can't believe it. So
it's the it's the zombie of ideas. It keeps coming back. So we actually took the research team, myself and the analysts, took an oversimplified approach where eventually, can the price on carbon get high enough that it overcomes the cost to transition, to change your technology? But after talking to you and really having that assumption challenged, we rethought how we were thinking about prices of carbon. And there's no way politically right now, like in terms of I want carbon to cost more because I care about the environment. That's not happening right now. But there are geopolitical drivers that could increase the attractiveness of a price on carbon in the United States. It's twofold. One, in response to Europe's border adjustment, we could say, well, yeah, you're right. US has some of the lowest carbon intensity manufacturing in the world. We should benefit from that. You want to really support Made in America? Well, let's have everything that has a higher intensity manufacturing, China, etc. Now you have a price on carbon coming in. That could absolutely happen in the whole tariff debate about it if they decide, if the administration starts thinking in that direction. The other way it could come into play, and I saw this discussed in research for a different client actually earlier in the year, it could come into play in talking about paying for the extension of the tax credits. We're trying to figure out where that money is going to come from. A carbon price sort of reemerged in thinking about that as a potential place for the money to come from. So there's two avenues it could come back into the conversation to watch for.
It had become fashionable a bit ago for oil and gas companies and utilities to support a price on carbon. Like if the public wants lower carbon stuff, then we have to have a way to discern among carbon intensities. So it will be interesting. And then I would say, interestingly, like left-leaning groups became opposed. So there was sort of that dynamic. So it will be really interesting to see if a price on carbon in one of its incarnations could reemerge in a novel enough way that it could have support among both climate hawks and low or no carbon energy producers as a way to incentivize their success. So in a global environment, that makes sense. Like the whole, if we could transform the US conversation from don't produce oil and gas to provide the lowest carbon molecules on the planet to those who need to use it, that would just be such a healthier, productive transformation. And I think you have to have a price on carbon to do it well. Like to not say, well, just go get your oil from, pick your national oil company. So we'll see. So Becca, last question I ask all my guests. What are you most optimistic about?
This was sort of a push for me. Thank you for pushing me, Tisha, because I'm not in the most optimistic mindset a lot of the time these days. But there was a study out there in the Journal of Energy, led by a Sarah Troise. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, as the lead researcher. But they created this tool where they had participants construct their ideal portfolio of energy going forward. And 75 respondents had a diverse portfolio, and a majority of them included carbon capture in that portfolio. So I think what I'm optimistic about is that people are seeing the real decarbonization path. They really are seeing that pragmatic approach to the energy transition, and that perhaps the all or nothing viewpoint is waning just a little bit. And I think that's what I'm most optimistic about.
That is definitely worth celebrating. So I'm excited. Let's link to that study in the show notes. So everybody who needs a little plug can have it. Becca, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
This has been fun. Thank you.
That's our episode for today. Thank you so much to our listeners for your engagement in our work. And thank you to Becca for joining me. I also, a special thanks to our team at Adamantine who has done all of this moment research. So Becca has led it, but my colleagues Manav and Morgan have been central to the analysis that we've been doing at Adamantine. Now, I promised you some color commentary. So here it goes. There are some really interesting takeaways that are coming out of our research. And they speak to this idea that perhaps it could be in your interest as an oil and gas company, it could be a competitive advantage to take advantage of where we might make more progress on emissions reductions and climate action under Trump. Here's why I think that's possible. One, US oil and gas has a bunch of advantages in a carbon constrained market. So if there are essentially trade wars that in some way incentivize carbon, there are in many circumstances, US and in fact, Canadian also, North American energy is going to be advantaged on a global marketplace. So if you want to make America great again, if you want to make North America great again, one thing you will do is consider the competitive advantage of our lower carbon intensity oil and gas. So that's one thing worth thinking about. The second is at this moment where oil and gas has a seat at many political tables that were not perhaps open a few months ago. The lowest hanging fruit on decarbonization is all going to happen in innovations in and around the oil and gas industry. So this is things like fuel switching, right? Fuel switching from coal to natural gas, moving from higher intensity carbon intensity oil and natural gas to lower intensity. And then in those environments where carbon is going to be a key trade-off for consideration, the oil and gas adjacent technologies are going to be competitively advantaged because of the industry know-how, because of our ability to scale, and because of the investment companies are making. So things like geothermal for power, gas generation plus carbon capture. That's going to come online a lot faster and a lot cheaper than small modular nuclear. Fuel switching in many environments to lower and no carbon fuels. So there's just going to be more willingness to make incremental progress and to have more solutions where carbon is a consideration. And there's still, let's remember, a whole lot of countries and states and jurisdictions that are still putting climate-centric environmental planning, energy planning is central to their mission. The last thing is that, as I said in my piece, pragmatic environmentalism is inevitable. I think, or practical environmentalism is inevitable. I think that blue states are going to be more open to incremental progress and to partnering where they can get things done. And so being all the seats at the tables, all the tents that we were not invited in suddenly become interesting. So of course, none of this is inevitable, but it makes a lot of sense to be thinking about the competitive advantage and the trajectory. Like, where are we going? When the political pendulum swings again, what are companies doing to position themselves with a resilient strategy, an innovative forward strategy? So I think that's really interesting. So thinking about things in an innovative way, about the long game, particularly at this moment where it is not fashionable, that's what good leaders do. So more to come on that. I'm thinking a lot about how we talk to climate-centric audiences about these solutions, and I'm thinking a lot about how we talk to leaders about the moment in a way that they will be interested in what we have to say. So please take a moment if you enjoyed this conversation and rate us. A 5-star rating helps other people find our podcast. If you enjoyed this kind of conversation, this kind of exploration, I hope you'll go to energythinks.com and subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleagues Manav and Morgan and Becca for making all this research possible. And thanks to Kayla Tribes for making all things Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.